Husband poisons wife to marry her daughter. Shocking true crime documentary. Hook. What happens when trust is broken and betrayal runs deep. Watch as a twisted plot unravels, a husband's dark secret, and a deadly chase through the night. Will they escape, or is the nightmare just beginning? Stay with us till the end. You won't believe what happens next. The kitchen smelled faintly of burnt toast. A quiet hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. She turned the faucet on, the water rushing cold against her hand. Her fingers trembled slightly, but she couldn't place why. The sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting thin lines across the floor. It felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. Then she heard him, his footsteps on the hallway tile, slow, deliberate. She didn't look up. He stood in the doorway, watching her. His presence felt heavy, almost suffocating. She didn't question it. Not yet. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice too soft. Her gaze shifted to the glass of water on the counter. She had never noticed how still it seemed. Unnaturally still. "Fine," she replied, the word hanging in the air like a lie. There was a sharp taste in her mouth, metallic and bitter. Her stomach churned. It was subtle, but there. Something was wrong. She took a sip of the water. Her throat felt dry. The coldness hit her chest like ice. "I think I need some rest," she murmured. Her voice cracked, betraying her. He stepped closer, a smile flickering on his lips. His breath smelled faintly of coffee. "Of course," he said, his hand reaching out to touch her shoulder. She stiffened. A sudden wave of dizziness made her sway. He didn't pull back. The room spun. Her vision blurred, then sharpened. Her legs gave way, and she collapsed onto the floor. Everything felt muffled, distant. The last thing she saw before everything went dark was his face, his smile wide, too wide. She woke up to silence. The room was darker now and colder. Her head throbbed painfully, a constant pulsing ache. She tried to move, but her limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. The air was thick, almost suffocating. There was something wrong with the air. The smell, chemical, sharp. It made her skin crawl. He was sitting by the window. His profile was still, watching her. "You're awake," he said. His voice was calm. Too calm. Her mind raced. The nausea, the dizziness, the strange taste in her mouth. "What did you do?" she whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. He didn't answer. Instead, he stood and walked toward her, slow steps. The truth settled in her chest like a stone, and she understood. All of it. The water, the subtle poisoning, the plan. But why? Why her? He bent down to meet her eyes. His lips barely parted. "It's for the best," he said softly. Her heart skipped a beat. Her breath caught. "For the best?" His face was calm, serene, but there was something behind his eyes, something cold. He had done it. He had poisoned her, so he could marry her daughter. Her body went rigid, the reality settling like lead in her chest. You poisoned me?" The words were faint, a rasp escaping her throat. He didn't blink. His gaze remained unwavering. A flicker of something cold, calculating. "It's for her," he said, his voice almost soothing. "For her future. For both of us." Her breath was shallow now, each inhale sharp and strained. She could feel the room closing in, the walls pressing against her. Her limbs still felt heavy, unresponsive, but her mind raced. "She doesn't know," he continued. His voice had taken on a gentler tone, almost affectionate. "But she will, soon. She'll understand. She'll be grateful." His eyes glinted in the dim light. A slow smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Grateful," she managed to croak. Her throat burned, but she forced the words out. "She'll have everything," he whispered, moving closer, his presence overwhelming. "She'll have me. She'll have it all." Her stomach lurched. The thought of him with her daughter, made her sick. You won't get away with this," she spat, though her voice shook. He knelt beside her now, his face inches from hers. His eyes darkened, the smile fading into something much colder. "You'll never remember," he said, his voice low, menacing. "And when she finds out, it'll be too late. She'll be mine." The words pierced her like a knife, a cold, cruel reality. Her mind was slipping. The poison was taking hold. Everything blurred once more. The room was spinning faster now, spinning away from her grasp. Her eyelids fluttered. Her breath grew more labored, shallow. She couldn't focus, couldn't hold on. But in that moment, one thing was crystal clear. He had planned this. The betrayal, the poisoning, all for her daughter. And she was powerless to stop it. Her vision darkened at the edges. But she fought to stay awake. Her hands were trembling, fingers twitching, desperate to grasp onto something, anything. But her body wouldn't respond. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat feeling weaker, slower. She could feel the poison working its way deeper, claiming her. But a part of her refused to give in. Her mind screamed for clarity, for action. He wasn't done. Not yet. She forced her eyes open again, the room a blur of shadows and light. His face hovered over her, a twisted expression of calm. He was enjoying this. "You think you're the first to try something like this?" she whispered, barely able to form the words. He didn't answer, but the cold glint in his eyes spoke volumes. "You won't get away with it," she repeated, her voice stronger now, despite the weakness flooding her body. His smile didn't falter. "You're already gone," he said softly. She clenched her teeth, trying to summon strength to fight back, but it was slipping through her fingers like sand. The last of her breath caught in her chest as her eyelids fluttered, closed again. The world around her spun faster. Her body was numb, cold. She tried to open her mouth to scream, but nothing came out. Her thoughts fragmented, slipping further away. The last thing she felt was the chill of the floor beneath her, the overwhelming silence that settled over the room. And then everything faded. Her world went black. The man stood over her, watching her still form with a strange sense of satisfaction. He was already thinking ahead, of the life he would have, of her daughter. The plan was almost complete. Time passed in a haze of shadows and silence. He waited. He watched her, almost savoring the stillness. Her breathing was shallow, barely noticeable. Her chest rose and fell in a slow rhythm that gave him a sick sense of control. It felt too easy. The poison was working its way through her veins, but there was something unsettling about how long it was taking. He leaned in, close enough to hear her breath catch, but she didn't wake, not yet. His fingers brushed the edge of her cheek, cold now, lifeless. A soft sigh escaped his lips, almost disappointed. Then, the faintest noise broke the silence. A cough. It was weak, a quiet, strangled sound, but it pulled him from his reverie. Her eyes flickered open, barely. Her pupils were dilated, unfocused. She blinked slowly, the room swimming in and out of clarity. "You're still here," she rasped, her voice hoarse, a faint tremble in her words. He watched her struggle, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. He hadn't anticipated this. She wasn't supposed to wake, but there she was, alive, barely clinging to consciousness. "You're not done," she managed to whisper, her eyes narrowing with growing suspicion. He stood still for a moment, caught off guard. "No," he said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "You're not dead yet." Her hand twitched, a faint spark of defiance. Her breathing steadied, if only for a moment, and in that brief instant, he realized how much he underestimated her. The woman who lay before him, so fragile, so broken, was still holding on to something. She wasn't done yet, and now neither was he. The house felt empty now, desolate in a way it never had before. Her footsteps echoed as she moved through the hall, the silence pressing down, heavy and thick. Her mind raced as she moved. Her daughter. She had to find her, make sure she was safe. The memories of the last few days flooded her thoughts. The subtle signs, the quiet unease, the moments she had brushed off as nothing. Now they all made sense. She reached the stairs, her legs weak beneath her, but she pushed forward. Each step felt like a lifetime, but she didn't stop. At the top of the stairs, she paused. Her heart thudded loudly in her chest. What would she say? How could she explain? Her daughter's bedroom door was ajar, a sliver of light spilling out. She knocked softly, her knuckles barely making a sound. "Sweetheart," she called, her voice hoarse, but strong. There was a brief silence, then the sound of footsteps inside. The door opened, and her daughter stood there, looking at her with wide, confused eyes. "Mom," she asked, her voice tinged with concern. Her daughter's gaze flicked to her mother's hands, still trembling, still holding the knife. "Mom, what's—" Her daughter's voice caught in her throat as she took in the blood on her mother's clothes. "Mom, what happened?" she asked again, her voice soft but fearful. Her mother took a deep breath, steadying herself before speaking. "Listen to me, sweetheart," she said, her voice low but urgent. "I need to tell you everything." Her daughter's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but she stepped aside, allowing her mother into the room. She lowered the knife to the side, her grip loosening as she took a deep breath. For a moment, there was nothing but the quiet between them. And then she spoke, the truth pouring out. She told her everything, the poison, the betrayal, the man who had been lurking in their lives for months. Her daughter listened, her face pale, her expression unreadable as the story unfolded. And when the last words left her mother's mouth, there was a heavy silence. Her daughter stood still, her eyes wide, frozen in disbelief. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. The weight of it all was too much, but she knew her daughter would understand. Slowly, her daughter stepped forward, her face softened, tears filling her eyes. You're safe now, Mom," she said, her voice trembling. "We're going to be okay." Her mother nodded, holding her daughter close. It wasn't over. The man downstairs was still breathing, still a danger, but not for long. Together, they would make sure he could never hurt them again. The silence in the house felt almost oppressive now, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Her daughter clung to her, her face pale, still trying to comprehend the whirlwind they had just survived. They moved through the house, each step heavier than the last, their presence somehow louder than the sounds of the world outside. The weight of everything felt crushing, like the aftermath of a storm, leaving only the broken remnants of what had once been. Her mother glanced back at her daughter, her heart aching with a mix of guilt and relief. She had saved her, but at what cost? "You're safe now," she whispered. It wasn't a promise. It was a reality. Her daughter nodded, but there was a shadow in her eyes, the knowledge that things could never be the same. Not after this. They couldn't stay in the house. It was tainted now, filled with too many memories, too much bloodshed. Her mother knew that, but it didn't matter. They would leave. They would rebuild. Outside, the air was cold, the night settling in like a heavy fog. They didn't speak as they packed, each of them lost in their thoughts. Her mother's mind was a whirlwind of plans, a new start, a new life, but the darkness still lingered in her chest, a reminder of everything they had lost, and everything they had fought for. She glanced at her daughter, whose eyes were distant, almost vacant. She hadn't spoken much since they made their way outside, but her mother knew. She could see it in her face. Her daughter had lost more than just a father. She had lost her innocence, and her mother would carry that weight too. "We'll figure this out," her mother said, her voice rough but determined. "We'll make it through." Together, her daughter's lips quivered, but she nodded, though the pain in her eyes was undeniable. Her mother took her hand, leading her away from the house, away from the nightmare that had nearly consumed them. The road ahead was uncertain, but they would walk it together, one step at a time, and this time they were in control. The night stretched on, the stars above distant and cold, but their path was clear. There was no turning back now. They didn't speak much as they walked, their footsteps steady and rhythmic, like an unspoken agreement that they would endure. Her mother glanced at her daughter, her heart heavy with the weight of all they had been through. Her daughter, so strong in the face of everything, still carried the shadows of fear in her eyes. "We'll find somewhere safe," her mother said softly, her voice breaking the silence. "We'll start fresh." Her daughter nodded, but her eyes were distant, lost in thought. They reached a small, quiet town after hours of walking, the glow of streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. It was peaceful here, a far cry from the chaos they had left behind. They found a small motel on the edge of town, its sign flickering faintly in the dark. It was nothing luxurious, but it was a place to rest, to breathe. Her mother paid for the room, her hands still trembling, but she didn't show it. They had survived, and now they needed to survive again, one night at a time. The room was small, the bed modest, but it was theirs for the moment. Her daughter sat on the edge of the bed, her face tired, haunted. Her mother sat beside her, putting an arm around her shoulders. "Do you want to talk?" she asked quietly. Her daughter shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what to say, Mom." Her mother understood. The words couldn't come yet, but they would, in time. For now, there was only silence, a silence that was both comforting and suffocating. The world outside was quiet, as if holding its breath along with them. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more uncertainty, but they would face it together. Her mother kissed her forehead, whispering, "We'll be okay." Her daughter didn't respond, but she leaned into her mother, her small body seeking the warmth of protection. As her mother closed her eyes, the weight of everything still pressing on her, she knew they would rebuild. It wouldn't be easy. It would never be easy, but they would find their way, one step at a time. The soft hum of the motel's air conditioner was the only sound in the room, a low, constant drone that seemed to fill the silence between them. Her daughter's breathing was steady now, though still too quiet, as if she were holding her emotions in check. Her mother lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind a storm of thoughts. They couldn't stay here long. They couldn't stay anywhere for long. But for tonight, they were safe, at least for now. As the hours passed, the weight of exhaustion began to settle into her bones. But sleep wouldn't come, not yet. She kept her eyes on the faint shadows of the room, the world outside still so vast and unknown. But with her daughter beside her, she felt a glimmer of hope in the darkest corner of her mind. Morning would come soon, but before it did, there was one thing her mother had to do. She slipped out of bed, quietly, not wanting to wake her daughter. She crossed the small room to the window, peering out into the dark. The street was empty, the distant glow of the town's lights flickering against the horizon. She wondered if he was still out there, if anyone would come looking for them. But she couldn't think about that now. She had to focus on the immediate, on getting through the next day. her hand clenched into a fist at her side. The man she had once called her husband, the man who had betrayed her and put her daughter in harm's way, he was dead. And while she didn't mourn him, she knew his death would echo in their lives for a long time. There would be questions, there would be investigations, and the truth would come to light. But for now, there was only the road ahead, and her daughter's quiet presence beside her. She turned back to the bed, sitting on the edge, watching her daughter's face as she slept. There was peace in her expression now, though still fragile. Her mother gently brushed a lock of hair from her forehead. "We'll keep going," she whispered, her voice low but resolute. "We'll keep going until we find a place where we can finally breathe." Her daughter stirred slightly, but didn't wake. Her mother's eyes lingered on her, a mix of love, guilt, and determination swirling inside. Tomorrow they would make their move. Tomorrow they would find a new life. But for now, they had this moment, a fragile, fleeting moment of safety. And for the first time in what felt like forever, her mother allowed herself to close her eyes, finally giving in to the exhaustion. Together, they would survive. The soft rays of the morning sun began to filter through the thin curtains, casting a pale glow across the room. Her mother awoke, the weight of sleep still pressing on her, but a new sense of urgency settled over her. She turned toward her daughter, still curled in a ball on the bed, her chest rising and falling with each peaceful breath. Her face was soft, vulnerable in her sleep, and for a moment, her mother allowed herself to just watch her. But the clock was ticking. Time was always running out. She knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. She gently slid out of bed, making sure not to disturb her daughter. Her mind raced with thoughts of what came next. She had no plan, no real destination, but they had to move. They had to leave this place before someone noticed them. After a few moments, her daughter stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She blinked, disoriented, then slowly met her mother's gaze. "Good morning," her mother said softly, forcing a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Her daughter sat up slowly, stretching as though the weight of the previous day was still on her. "Morning," she whispered back. They didn't speak for a few moments, each of them processing the new day. But the silence didn't feel as oppressive as it had the night before. It felt like a shared understanding. They were in this together. Her daughter looked up at her, eyes full of questions. "You're okay, right?" she asked, her voice small. Her mother's heart clenched. "Yeah, sweetheart, I'm okay." But she wasn't entirely sure if that was true. They couldn't stay in this room forever. Her mother stood up, taking a deep breath. "I think it's time to go. We need to find somewhere else." Her daughter nodded, looking resigned. "Okay, Mom." There was a quiet strength in her voice, a maturity that had emerged far too soon. They packed quickly, moving with a sense of quiet urgency. Her mother tried to hide the trembling of her hands as she gathered their things, but her daughter noticed, giving her a look that said everything. She wasn't hiding anything anymore. They left the motel room without a word, stepping into the cold morning air. Her mother held the door open for her daughter, and they made their way to the car. The world outside seemed so normal, so unbothered by the turmoil they had endured. But for them, nothing would ever be the same. They were on the run now, moving forward without knowing exactly where they were headed. But they had each other, and that was enough. Her mother drove in silence, the weight of the unknown pressing down on her chest. Where would they go? How would they survive? But one thing was certain. They weren't going to stop. The road stretched before them, long and uncertain. But with each mile they put between themselves and the past, they grew stronger. Together, they would face whatever came next. The road ahead was endless, just a ribbon of asphalt winding through the open countryside. Her mother's grip on the steering wheel was tight, her knuckles pale against the dark leather. But she didn't flinch. She couldn't afford to. Her daughter sat beside her, quiet, eyes fixed on the passing landscape. She hadn't said much since they left the motel, her thoughts likely still tangled in the chaos they'd just escaped. "Do you think he's—" Her daughter's voice trailed off, as though she didn't want to finish the question. Her mother glanced over at her, then back to the road. She didn't have a simple answer. "No, he won't come after us anymore," she said, her voice steady, but the doubt lingered in her chest. The truth was, she wasn't sure. Would there be someone looking for them? Would the authorities think it was an accident, or something more? Her eyes flickered briefly to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see flashing lights in the distance. But there was nothing but the quiet stretch of highway, the sun rising higher in the sky. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to hope. Maybe they could disappear. Maybe they could find a place to vanish, somewhere they could rebuild, far from the life they'd known. "Mom," her daughter said, her voice quieter now. "I don't know where we're going, but I trust you." Her words hit her mother like a punch to the gut, and she had to swallow the lump in her throat. Her daughter's trust was everything. "I promise," her mother whispered, her voice thick. "We'll make it. We'll start over. Somewhere safe." They continued to drive, the world outside shifting from rural farmlands to more populated areas. Her mother's eyes were sharp, her mind still calculating. She couldn't let her guard down. Not now. But as they entered the next town, something caught her attention. A figure on the side of the road. A man, standing in front of a small convenience store, his eyes scanning the traffic. Her pulse quickened. She didn't know why, but something about him made her uneasy. "Mom," her daughter asked, noticing the change in her mother's expression. Her mother didn't answer right away, her eyes narrowing on the figure as they passed by. No, it was nothing, just another person. But then she saw it, a flash of something in the man's hand. It looked like a phone. He was staring directly at their car. Her heart skipped a beat. Could it be? The man was still standing there, watching them drive away, but her mind raced. What if he was waiting for someone? What if he had seen them? She forced herself to focus, keeping her gaze on the road ahead. "Don't look back," she told her daughter. "Just keep looking forward." Her daughter nodded, but her eyes were wide, and her mother could see the fear beginning to creep in. "Mom, what's going on?" Her mother didn't have a clear answer. She didn't know, but there's something in the air, something that made her feel like the past wasn't done with them yet. They drove on, but the uneasy feeling remained, lingering in the pit of her stomach. They had made it this far, but had they really escaped? The unease gnawed at her, the feeling that something was off, something lurking just beyond their reach. Her grip tightened on the wheel, her eyes scanning the rearview mirror every few seconds. Nothing. But that wasn't enough to ease the tension building in her chest. Her daughter shifted in her seat, fidgeting, sensing her mother's growing anxiety. "Mom, what's wrong?" Her voice was quieter now, almost pleading. "I'm not sure," her mother replied, forcing a calm she didn't feel. "It's probably nothing, just nerves." But even as the words left her lips, she knew they weren't true. Her instincts were screaming at her. That man, she had felt his gaze, his eyes tracking their car as they passed. It had been too casual, too deliberate. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them, that they weren't as far from their past as they thought. Minutes passed, but every passing car seemed to make her more anxious. She could almost hear the sirens in her head, feel the weight of the law coming down on them. Mom. Her daughter's voice was tentative, but there was a tremor in it now. Her mother glanced over at her, her heart sinking. I know, sweetheart. I know. They needed to find a place to stop, a place to think. Her mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. Where could they go? Who could they trust? And then, as if on cue, a car appeared in her rearview mirror. It was a black sedan, following them at a steady distance. At first, it was subtle, just another car on the road, but it didn't leave. The seconds felt like hours. Her heart began to pound harder in her chest. The sedan stayed with them, never getting too close, but never falling behind. Her mother's thoughts were jumbled. Was it coincidence? Or was someone really following them? She turned onto a quieter road, hoping the sedan would pass them by. But it didn't. It followed. Her daughter's face had gone pale, eyes wide with growing fear. Mom, what do we do? She forced a breath, her voice calm but tight. We keep driving. Just stay calm. We'll figure this out. But inside, she knew things were spiraling out of control. They were no longer in control of their own fate. The car was still behind them. She had to make a decision. Hold on, she muttered under her breath. She sped up, making a sharp turn down a narrow street, hoping to lose them in the maze of alleyways. Her heart raced as the sedan followed, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Mom, her daughter cried. What are you doing? We're getting away from them. She took another turn, more sharp than the last, her tires screeching on the wet pavement, but the sedan kept up, never falling behind, staying right on their tail. Her breath was shallow now, panic clawing at her throat. This wasn't just some coincidence. Someone was after them, and they weren't going to stop. The car's engine roared louder in her ears as she sped through the twisting streets. Every turn felt like a gamble. Would they lose the sedan or only draw it closer? Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her daughter's voice, faint and trembling, broke through the roaring panic. Mom, they're right behind us. Her mother's heart hammered in her chest. She didn't look back, but she could feel the heavy presence of the car. It was there, always there, relentless. She needed a plan, something, anything to shake them off. But the streets ahead seemed endless, the dark alleyways all blending together. Her pulse quickened. What if they weren't just following? What if they knew exactly where they were headed? What if this had been planned all along? She could feel the weight of her daughter's fear in the air between them, thick and suffocating. Her daughter was scared, and so was she. But they couldn't let the fear stop them. Not now. She glanced at the rearview mirror for just a second. The black sedan was still there, so close now it was almost impossible to deny. Her stomach twisted. She had to lose them. She had to act fast. Without a second thought, her mother slammed on the brakes. The car lurched forward, the tires screeching against the asphalt. The sedan was too close. It couldn't react fast enough. She spun the wheel, forcing the car into a sharp U-turn. The tires squealed as the car turned on its axis, sending them back the other way. Hold on, her mother shouted, her voice strained. Her daughter gasped, bracing herself as the car whipped around. The sedan had to slow down to make the turn, but it was still there, right behind them. But her mother was gaining distance now. Her foot slammed harder on the accelerator. She pushed the car forward, the engine roaring, the sound of her heartbeat thrumming in her ears. The sedan was further behind now, but not by much. Mom, what are we doing? Her daughter's voice was urgent, fear threading through her words. We're getting away, her mother replied, her voice calm despite the storm in her chest. She wasn't sure how much longer they could outrun it, but she wasn't stopping until they did. She took another turn, and then another, the car's tires gripping the road with a sharp hiss. The streets were becoming less familiar, less safe. She needed a place to hide, and then she saw it. A small parking lot ahead, the back of a building tucked into the shadows. Without hesitation, she whipped the car into the lot, slamming on the brakes just as they entered the shadows. The sedan was still following, but now they had a chance. The mother killed the engine, letting the silence of the parking lot surround them. Her heart was pounding, the adrenaline still rushing through her veins. Mom, what if they saw us? Her daughter's voice trembled with panic. They're not going to find us here, her mother said, her voice low, calm. She turned off the headlights, her breath steadying. The parking lot was dark, hidden away behind the back of a small business. They waited. Minutes passed. Nothing. The sedan never entered the lot. Her mother exhaled slowly, her hands still trembling on the wheel. For a moment, everything was still. Her daughter was silent beside her, her small face pale in the dark. We lost them, her mother whispered, but she wasn't entirely sure if it was true. There was a fleeting moment of relief, but the danger was far from over. They couldn't stay here. They couldn't stay anywhere for long. The world outside felt too big, too uncertain, and they were running out of places to hide. Her mother looked at her daughter, taking in her expression. The fear was still there, but so was something else, a quiet resolve. They would keep going. They would survive. One step at a time. The silence in the car was suffocating. Her mother's eyes flickered between the rearview mirror and the dark road ahead, waiting for any sign that the sedan was still out there. Her heart was still pounding, but she couldn't let herself relax, not yet. Mom, what now? Her daughter's voice was small, her fear still hanging heavy in the air. Her mother swallowed, trying to steady her nerves. We keep moving, she said softly. Just keep moving. She didn't have a clear plan anymore, just a vague sense of direction. They couldn't go back to the motel, and staying in this town was no longer an option. Every passing moment felt like a countdown, each minute another step closer to the danger they'd barely escaped. Her mother glanced around the dark parking lot. It was hidden, quiet, but it wouldn't stay that way forever. She could feel it in her bones. They needed to find a new place, a safer place. She turned the key in the ignition, the car's engine humming to life once again. Without saying another word, she pulled out of the lot, driving slowly at first, trying to stay under the radar. The streets seemed emptier now, but she knew that wasn't a good sign. It was too quiet, too still. Mom, where are we going? Her daughter's voice came again, this time more insistent. I don't know yet, her mother said, her grip on the wheel tightening. Maybe we'll head to the next town over, find a place to lay low for a while. She could hear the doubt in her own voice, but there was no other choice. They had to keep moving. They couldn't afford to stay in one place for long. As they drove through the narrow streets, her mind raced with possibilities. What if the man from the motel was just the beginning? What if someone was tracking them? Her daughter's soft voice broke through her thoughts. Mom, I can't keep doing this. Her mother's heart twisted. She knew. She felt the weight of it too. This life, running, hiding, it wasn't something a child should have to endure. We're going to make it, her mother said, her voice tight but firm. We'll find a way out of this, I promise. But the truth was, she didn't know how. The world felt too big now, too dangerous. As they crossed into the outskirts of town, her eyes scanned the horizon, looking for any sign of safety, a place to breathe. In the distance, she saw lights ahead, a gas station on the edge of town. It was the only sign of life, a fleeting chance. Stop here, her mother said abruptly. She pulled into the gas station lot, the low hum of the neon lights flickering above them. It was isolated, quiet, perfect for a quick stop. Her mother's eyes flicked to the windows of the small store. No one seemed to be around, but they couldn't stay in the car forever. She turned to her daughter. "Stay in the car. I'll just be a minute." Her daughter nodded, but her eyes were filled with uncertainty. Her mother gave her a reassuring smile, though it felt more like a mask. She couldn't let her daughter see how badly her own nerves were fraying. She opened the door and stepped out, the cold air hitting her skin. Her eyes scanned the surroundings once more, and she walked quickly toward the store. Every step felt like it echoed in the stillness, her senses on high alert. She was so close to losing control, so close to cracking, but there was no choice. She had to keep moving forward. Inside the store, she grabbed a few supplies, water, snacks, anything they could use to keep going. As she paid, the cashier barely looked up, lost in whatever world he lived in. Her heart beat harder as she turned to leave. Every step felt like a countdown, each breath sharper, more urgent. As she opened the door, a flash of movement caught her eye. A figure, distant but unmistakable, moved quickly past the front of the store. It was the man, the one who had been watching them. Her heart stopped. They had found them. Before she could react, the door slammed shut behind her, and she ran back to the car. "Get in," she shouted, her voice filled with panic. Her daughter's eyes were wide, but she didn't hesitate. Her mother slammed the car into gear, the tires screeching as she pulled away. They couldn't stop now. The figure was already moving toward the car, but her mother didn't look back. They had to outrun him. Again, the engine roared to life, the car jerking forward as her mother slammed the gas pedal. Her daughter gasped, the sound of screeching tires filling the air, but her mother didn't slow down. They sped away from the gas station, the figure now barely a blur in the rearview mirror. But it didn't feel like enough. Not nearly enough. Her heart pounded in her chest, the adrenaline crashing through her veins. Every moment felt like a heartbeat away from disaster. Her eyes darted between the road and the mirror, searching for any sign of danger. "Mom, do you think he saw us?" Her daughter's voice trembled, but it was steady with fear. "I don't know," her mother replied, her grip tight on the wheel. But something inside her told her it didn't matter. They were being hunted, and there was no safe place anymore. Her mind raced, her thoughts fragmented as she pushed the car faster, the speedometer climbing with each passing second. Where could they go? Where could they hide? But all she could think about was getting away, just getting away from whatever nightmare they had run into. They left the town behind them, the familiar landscape slipping into the distance. But it felt like no matter how fast they drove, it wasn't far enough. Her thoughts twisted in a dark spiral. What if he was already calling for backup? What if someone else was waiting for them down the road? What if they'd been tracked the whole time? "Mom, I'm scared," her daughter whispered. Her mother's heart cracked. "I know, sweetheart. I know." She glanced at her daughter, the terror in her eyes mirrored in her own reflection. But she couldn't let it show. Not now. Ahead, the road stretched on, empty and uncertain. She had no plan, no destination. They were just running. But she knew they couldn't keep this up. They needed help, a place to hide, somewhere no one would think to look for them. The landscape started to change, the highway becoming more desolate, stretching out toward the horizon like an endless maze. There had to be a town somewhere ahead, somewhere they could blend in. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden flash of headlights in the rearview. She stiffened. The sedan. Her stomach dropped. He hadn't given up. The man was still on their tail, his headlights growing brighter with each passing second. Her mind raced again. How could they lose him this time? but there was no place to hide, no alleyways, no turns to take, just the wide-open road, and the relentless sound of the engine behind them. Her daughter's voice broke through the panic. "Mom, we can't outrun him. He's going to catch us." Her mother's breath caught. She couldn't let it happen. Not now. Suddenly, an idea formed in her mind. It wasn't perfect, but it was all they had. "We're going to have to take a risk." She muttered under her breath. "Hold on tight." She yanked the wheel to the right, slamming the car onto a small, unmarked road that veered off the highway. The tires skidded against loose gravel as the car careened down the narrow path. The sedan followed, but it was clear they couldn't keep up. The road was treacherous, bumpy and winding. Her hands gripped the wheel as she pushed the car forward, barely keeping control. Her eyes flickered to the rearview mirror. The sedan had slowed down, maybe not daring to follow into the unknown path. Her heart was racing. Her breath came in short bursts. She glanced at her daughter, who was gripping the seat with white-knuckled hands. "Are we safe?" her daughter asked, her voice shaking. "I don't know yet," her mother answered, trying to keep the fear out of her voice. The path ahead twisted into dense trees. It was dark now, the canopy above barely letting any light through. Her mother had no idea where this road led, but she wasn't stopping. They needed to get lost. They needed to disappear. And for a moment, as the car rumbled through the forest, she almost felt like they had. But the silence in the car, the stillness that hung between them, told her the danger wasn't over. Not by a long shot. They had bought some time. But time was running out. The car jolted over a particularly rough patch of road, shaking them both in their seats. Her mother's heart was still racing, but she couldn't afford to let up. Every bump, every turn felt like a gamble. Would the sedan keep following? Would they make it out alive? Her eyes darted back to the rearview mirror. The headlights were gone. Had they lost him? For a moment, the world felt quieter, the oppressive weight of fear lifting just a little. But she knew it was fleeting. The danger hadn't disappeared. It had only been delayed. "Mom," her daughter whispered, her voice barely audible. "Where are we going?" Her mother didn't have an answer. She wasn't sure anymore. She just kept driving. The narrow road twisted ahead, and she followed it, hoping it would lead them somewhere safe. The trees around them were dense, their branches hanging low like dark shadows, blocking out the remaining light. It felt as though they were driving into the unknown, the sense of isolation growing with every mile. Her fingers tightened around the wheel. Her thoughts were spiraling. What if they had made a wrong turn? What if they were deeper in the woods than they thought? The road ahead seemed endless. But then, as she rounded a corner, something caught her eye. A flicker of light. A cabin, barely visible through the thick trees, its small windows glowing faintly in the dark. Her breath caught in her throat. A cabin. It could be a place to rest, a place to think, and most importantly, it was isolated. Her pulse quickened as she steered the car toward it. It wasn't much, but it could be their only chance. She parked the car a few yards away, farthest from the cabin as possible. She didn't want to risk anyone seeing them. Her heart pounded in her chest, her hands trembling. "Stay quiet," she whispered to her daughter. "Stay low. We can't risk being seen." Her daughter nodded, her wide eyes filled with a fear that mirrored her own. They slipped out of the car and made their way toward the cabin, moving as silently as they could. Her mother's footsteps were quick but careful. Her mind focused on the goal. Get inside, get off the road. The cabin was old, its wood weathered and worn by years of neglect, but it was sturdy, and right now, it was exactly what they needed. Her mother pushed open the door, the rusty hinges squealing in protest. She froze, listening for any sounds of movement. Nothing. They stepped inside. The dim light inside barely enough to make out their surroundings. A musty smell lingered in the air, but there was a sense of quiet relief as they closed the door behind them. Her mother locked it quickly, taking a breath as she looked around. It was small, barely furnished. An old couch, a table in the corner, and a single flickering light hanging from the ceiling. Her daughter sank onto the couch, exhaustion settling into her bones. Her mother followed, taking a moment to steady herself before sitting beside her. For a few moments, they just sat there, in silence, listening to the distant sounds of the night. Her mother's mind wouldn't let her relax. She kept hearing the car's engine in her head, the screeching tires, the footsteps that had followed them. "Do you think we're safe here?" Her daughter's voice was small, but there was a quiet hope in it. Her mother didn't have an answer, but she held her daughter close, pressing her hand against her small, trembling fingers. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice low, "but we'll stay here for tonight. We'll figure it out tomorrow." It wasn't much, but it was the best she could offer. For now, they were safe. At least for now. But deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. The danger was still out there, and it was only a matter of time before they had to run again. The night dragged on in oppressive silence, the dim light of the cabin flickering like a dying ember. Her mother couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching them. Even in the dark, even when everything seemed still, the cabin was quiet, too quiet. Her daughter had fallen asleep beside her, her head resting on her mother's shoulder. But sleep felt impossible. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the cabin walls sent her heart into overdrive. She had to keep thinking, had to keep her mind sharp. They couldn't stay here forever. But where could they go? What was left for them? Hours passed, the moonlight slipping through the cracks in the wooden walls. Her eyes grew heavy, but she dared not sleep. Then the sound came, faint at first, but unmistakable. A car. Her breath caught in her throat. The unmistakable hum of an engine, growing louder, closer. Her heart pounded in her chest. No. It couldn't be him. It couldn't be them. She moved swiftly, glancing at her daughter, who was still asleep, unaware of the danger creeping closer. Her mother stepped cautiously toward the window, peering out through a crack in the curtains. Her eyes widened. The sedan. It was parked just outside, the headlights off, but the engine still idling. It had found them. Her mind raced. She couldn't let them take her daughter. She couldn't let him get to her. She rushed to the door, locking it again and again. But the sound of footsteps outside stopped her cold, heavy, deliberate. Someone was approaching. Her breathing quickened. She grabbed her daughter, shaking her gently. "Sweetheart, wake up." Her voice was urgent, frantic. "We have to go. Now." Her daughter stirred, groggy with sleep, but fear slowly washed over her face as she realized what was happening. "Mom, what's going on? We need to leave. Now." Her mother grabbed her hand, and together, they moved toward the back of the cabin. The door to the cabin's small storage room creaked open, revealing a narrow path that led into the woods. It was their only chance. As they slipped into the night, the sound of the approaching footsteps grew louder. It was too late to hide, but it wasn't too late to run. Her heart was in her throat as they ran, her feet pounding the earth, leaving the cabin behind. Her breath came in sharp gasps. Her mind focused on only one thing: escape. Behind them, the sound of the cabin door crashing open reached their ears, and then the unmistakable sound of pursuit. The chase had begun, but this time there would be no stopping. The moon was high above them, casting pale light through the trees as they ran. Her mother's breath came in ragged gasps, her legs burning with every step. But she didn't dare stop, not until they were far enough away. Her daughter's hand was tightly clasped in hers, the small fingers trembling, but holding on. Every crack of a twig beneath their feet seemed deafening, every rustle of the wind a reminder that they weren't alone. Her heart hammered in her chest, the fear of being caught urging her to push harder, to run faster. But something in her gut told her they couldn't keep this up forever. They had to find shelter, somewhere to lay low, somewhere safe. "Mom, I'm so tired." Her daughter's voice cracked, fear and exhaustion mixing together. "We're almost there," her mother whispered, her voice low and strained. "Just a little further." But the truth was, she didn't know where there was. The woods stretched endlessly around them, dark and unfamiliar. The path they'd taken felt like a blur, and the weight of each passing second pressed on her shoulders. Ahead, a small clearing came into view. She couldn't see much, but there were shapes moving in the distance. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. Could it be someone else? Another danger waiting in the dark? But then she saw it, a small cottage, the faint glow of a light flickering through the windows. It wasn't much, but it was a chance. Without a word, her mother pulled her daughter towards it. The door was unlocked, and they slipped inside quickly, closing it behind them. The room was empty, Spartan, but at least it was safe. For now, her mother moved to the window, peering out through a crack in the curtains. She didn't see any movement, didn't hear any footsteps. It seemed like they'd made it, at least for the time being. She turned to her daughter, who was breathing heavily, eyes wide with fear. But there was a flicker of hope in them now. "We're safe," her mother said softly, though she didn't entirely believe it. Not yet. They had come so far, and they had fought so hard to survive. But deep down, she knew the danger wasn't over. It never really was. But for tonight, they had made it. For tonight, they could rest. And tomorrow? Tomorrow, they would figure out how to move forward, how to escape it all. One step at a time,